Asian American reading, American diversity. Asian Americans are Americans of Asian descent. They or their ancestors came from Cambodia, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Laos, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. More than 21 million people of Asian descent live in the United States, which makes up 5.6% of the overall population. Today, Asians are the second fastest growing minority group after Hispanic Americans, mainly through new immigration. The first Asian immigrants who arrived in large numbers in the United States came from southeastern China. They immigrated to California in 1849 after gold was discovered. In 1882, however, the U.S. government began placing restrictions on Asian immigrants because of pressure from native born Americans. Many Americans feared job competition from newcomers and resented their foreign customs. It was not until 1965 that all restrictions against Asian immigrants were lifted. Today, their high rate of immigration makes Asians the country's fastest growing minority group. Who Asian Americans are. Asia is the world's largest continent and most populated. It has 50 countries. So the Asian American population consists of many different ethnic and cultural groups. Chinese Americans form the largest Asian group, making up about 4 million of the 21 million Asian Americans. Immigrants from the second largest group, with about 3 million, come from India. The next largest group are Americans of Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese ancestry. The languages of many Asian groups include Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Tagalog, Thai, and Vietnamese. Asian Americans practice several major religions, including Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, and Shintoism. Asian Americans differ in physical appearance, language, and culture from one another, as well as from other Americans. Success through hard work and self discipline is another value emphasized in most Asian American families. Children are encouraged to work hard in and out of school to be worthy of the sacrifices their parents make for them. Self control is also an important value. Children are taught that mature people do not show their feelings too readily. Where Asian Americans live. Most Asian Americans live in the western United States. Nearly half of the Asian population resides in the West. Almost one third of Asian Americans live in California. More than 95% of Asian Americans live in urban areas. About half of them have homes in cities, and about half live in suburbs. In cities, Asian Americans are often concentrated in ethnic neighborhoods, which are usually known by their names such as Chinatown or Little Tokyo. Asian influences on American culture. Tai Chi is a form of exercise that the Chinese have practiced for centuries. It has become especially popular among older Americans who find that its slow, gentle movements provide good exercise for aging bodies. Taekwondo is a traditional Korean martial art. It has been popularized by Korean immigrants who teach it to American youth. Judo is a traditional Japanese form of wrestling. Many U.S. colleges offer it in physical education programs. Chow mein and other Chinese foods are familiar to most Americans. Chow mein consists of steamed vegetables topped with chicken, beef, or seafood and served with fried noodles. A favorite for some Americans is sushi, a Japanese dish of vinegar flavored rice and raw fish or vegetables. Restaurants that serve spicy Thai or Indian food are popular. Many U.S. groceries carry the Korean dish kimchi, a highly seasoned mix of Chinese cabbage, red radishes, and other vegetables. Acupuncture is an ancient Chinese method of relieving pain and treating disease by inserting needles into the body. It has become accepted by the American medical profession as a way to treat certain ailments. The history of Asian immigration. Asian immigration began before the more than 200 years after the first wave of European immigrants. One reason for a slower start is the rulers of many Asian countries prohibited their subjects from going abroad. In some cases, people were caught attempting to leave were put to death. Another reason that Asians did not leave their homeland was that their societies were relatively stable. Asia did not experience the revolutions that brought political, economic, and social change to Europe. The people that had little reason to leave in search of a better life. But by the mid 1800s, the traditional Asian system began to prove ineffective in the face of increasing social problems. The first major social crisis erupted in China. The government began to weaken under repeated invasions, domestic revolts, and problems caused by overpopulation. The rulers could no longer control people who wanted to leave the country. The first wave of Asian immigration. The news in 1948 that gold had been discovered on a property in California attracted many people to the state. In 1849, about 700 Chinese arrived hoping to find work mining gold. They were poor peasants from southeastern China. Most of them did not have enough money to pay their fare, so they took out loans with a promise to pay them off when they found work in America. By the end of 1850, there were 4,000 Chinese in California. 10 years later, in 1860, the United States had a Chinese population of about 35,000, most of whom lived in California. Many newcomers in 1860 could not find work in mines, so they obtained jobs building the railroads. Initially, Californians greeted the first arrivals with enthusiasm, but soon competition for jobs became intense between white workers and the increasing number of Chinese workers. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. The act permitted only Chinese that were teachers, merchants, and a few other professions to immigrate to the United States. The restrictions resulted in part because American workers feared job competition, but also they argued that Asians could not assimilate or incorporate into American society because of their physical and cultural differences. The second wave. Hawaii did not become a state until 1959. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Hawaii was a destination for several Asian immigrant groups. The first group was made up of Japanese workers. In the late 1800s, a group of Hawaiian sugar plantations recruited almost 29,000 Japanese workers to contract laborers. After the Japanese workers fulfilled their contracts, most of them settled in Hawaii or moved on to the Pacific coast states of California, Oregon, and Washington. They worked first as farmhands and later purchased the land that they worked. In early in the early 1900s, the Japanese population in the Pacific coast states began to face the same opposition that had arisen against Chinese workers. In 1905, an organization that later became the Asiatic Exclusion League was established in California to work towards holding the immigration of Japanese people and other Asians to a limited few. In 1908, the United States and Japan reached an understanding that became known later as the Gentleman's Agreement. The agreement restricted new Japanese immigrants to the relatives of immigrants who had already settled in the United States. The Gentleman's Agreement was not a law and it was never put into writing. Japan cooperated voluntarily. Arrivals in the early 1900s. On the island of Hawaii, Japanese workers organized labor unions and frequently went on strike, demanding higher wages and better living conditions. The plantation owners turned to Korea, where the people had recently suffered through war and famine. During the early 1900s, the Hawaiian plantation owners recruited more than 7,000 Korean laborers. But Korean immigrants, but Korean immigration halted in 1905 when the Japanese government was in the process of taking over and controlling Korea. They put pressure on Koreans to stop immigration to Hawaii. The Hawaiian plantation owners then looked to the Philippines. By 1931, about 110,000 Filipino laborers had arrived to work the plantations. Groups of immigrants from India began arriving in the United States in the early 1900s. Most of the early immigrants were young men from farm households in search of job opportunities. Because of hostilities against the new Asian immigrants, many fled to Canada. Asian immigration halted. In 1917, Congress passed one of the country's most restrictive immigration laws. The law prohibited immigrants from any area of Asia and the majority of the Pacific Ocean islands. The Immigration Act of 1924 continues to bar immigration from countries in Asia, with one exception. People from the Philippines were allowed to enter. At that time, the Philippines was a U.S. possession, so Filipinos were not considered foreigners. However, the Tidings McDuffie Act of 1934 limited immigration from the Philippines to an annual quota of 50. Japanese internment. Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, caused the United States to enter World War II. It also stirred hostilities against the Japanese people in the United States. Many Americans associated Japanese Americans with the Japanese pilots who had destroyed U.S. Navy ships. The military chose to establish curfews for Japanese Americans and then started to remove all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to southern Arizona and confined them to detention camps until their loyalty could be determined. About 110,000 Japanese were confined to 10 detention camps scattered over 7 states. They lost their homes and their jobs as a result of being sent to the internment camps. In 1948, Congress passed a Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act. The law authorized a maximum payment of $2,500 to individual Japanese Americans as compensation for what they had lost while confined. Arrivals of the late 1900s. Millions of the Southeast Asians have come to the United States since the mid 1970s. Most of them fled their homeland as a result of the Vietnam War. The first wave to arrive were Vietnamese political refugees who had worked for the U.S. government or U.S. companies. For the most part, they were educated and skilled workers. Most of the second wave were rural people from Cambodia and Laos who had less education and fewer job skills. Asian Americans today. Like other minorities, Asians face problems of acceptance in American society. Also, like other minorities, Asians struggle against inaccurate images that many people have of them. On the one hand, motion pictures depict Asians as sinister villains or meek servants. Sociologists, on the other hand, have referred to Asians as the model minority. The label implies that all Asians have achieved success through discipline and hard work, and other minorities should imitate them. Although many Asian Americans succeed, many others do not. The median household income among Asian Americans is higher than that for the U.S. population as a whole. A higher percentage of Asian Americans receive doctorates every year than either African Americans or Hispanics. Yet, many Southeast Asian immigrants have little or no formal education. The efforts to learn English and to become part of American culture on the part of Asian Americans has led to another problem. Many young Asians in families of recent immigrants, in attempting to become part of the American culture, these young Asians often put aside their language and cultural traditions of their ancestors. As a result, they find themselves in conflict with their parents' generation. Asian American Reading for American Diversity.